Natural contract. Time and weather. By chance or wisdom, the French language uses a single word, temps, for the time that passes and for the weather outside, a product of climate and of what our ancestors called meteors. Today our expertise and worries turn toward the weather, because our industrious know-how is acting, perhaps catastrophically, on global nature, which those same ancestors thought didn't depend on us. From now on, not only does it doubtless depend on us, but in return, our lives depend on this mobile atmospheric system, which is inconstant but fairly stable, deterministic and stochastic, moving quasi-periodically with rhythms and response times that vary colossally. How are we adding to its variation? What serious disequilibria will occur? What global change must be expected in the whole climate from our growing industrial activities and technological prowess, which pour thousands of tons of carbon monoxide and other toxic wastes into the atmosphere? As of now, we don't know how to estimate general transformations on such a scale of size and complexity. Above all, we surely don't know how to think about the relations between time and weather, temps and temps, a single French word for two seemingly disparate realities. For do we know a richer and more complete model of global change, of equilibria and their attractors, than that of climate and the atmosphere? We are trapped in a vicious circle. In other words, what risks are we running? Above all, beyond what threshold and at what date or temporal limit will a major risk appear? Since, for the time being, we don't know the answers to these questions, prudence and politicians are asking what to do, when to do it, how and what to decide. First of all, who will decide? Peasant and Sailor. In days gone by, two men lived out in the often intemperate weather, the peasant and the sailor. How they spent their time, hour by hour, depended on the state of the sky and on the seasons. We've lost all memory of what we owe these two types of men, from the most rudimentary technologies to the highest subtleties. A certain ancient Greek text divides the earth into two zones, one where a given tool was regarded as a grain shovel, and another where a passerby recognized the same tool as an oar. In the West, these two populations are gradually disappearing from the face of the earth. Agricultural surpluses and high-tonnage vessels are turning the sea and the land into deserts. The greatest event of the 20th century incontestably remains the disappearance of agricultural activity at the helm of human life in general, and of individual cultures. Now living only indoors, immersed only in passing time and not out in the weather, our contemporaries, packed into cities, use neither shovel nor oar. Worse yet, they've never even seen them. Indifferent to the climate, except during their vacations when they rediscover the world in a clumsy Arcadian way, they naively pollute what they don't know, which rarely hurts them and never concerns them. Dirty species, monkeys and motorists, drop their filth fast, because they don't live in the space they pass through, and thus let themselves foul it. Once again, who decides? Scientists, administrators, journalists? How do they live, and more important, where? In laboratories, where the sciences reproduce phenomena to define them better. In offices or studios. In short, indoors. The climate never influences our work anymore. How do we keep ourselves busy? With numerical data, equations, dossiers, legal texts, news bulletins hot off the press or the wire. In short, language. True language for science, normative language for administrators, sensational language for the media. From time to time, some expert, a climatologist or an earth scientist, goes off on official business to gather on-site observations, like some reporter or inspector. But the essentials take place indoors and in words, never again outdoors with things. We've even walled up the windows in order to hear one another better or argue more easily. We communicate irrepressibly. We busy ourselves only with our own networks. Those who share power today have forgotten nature, which could be said to be taking its revenge, but which, more to the point, is reminding us of its existence, we who live in time but never right out in the weather. We claim to talk meaningfully about the weather. Now we have to make decisions about it. We have lost the world. We've transformed things into fetishes or commodities, the stakes of our stratagems, and our a-cosmic philosophies, for almost half a century now, have been holding forth only on language or politics, writing or logic. At the very moment when we are acting physically for the first time on the global earth, and when it, in turn, is doubtless reacting on global humanity, we are tragically neglecting it. Long-term and short-term. But even if we are reduced to living only in time, not in weather, in which time, once again, are we living? The universal answer today, in the very short term. To safeguard the earth or respect the weather, the wind and rain, we would have to think toward the long term, and because we don't live out in the weather, we've unlearned how to think in accordance with its rhythms and its scope. Concerned with maintaining his position, the politician makes plans that rarely go beyond the next election. The administrator reigns over the fiscal or budgetary year, and news goes out on a daily and weekly basis. As for contemporary science, it's born in journal articles that almost never go back more than 10 years. Even if work on the paleoclimate recapitulates tens of millennia, it goes back less than 3 decades itself. It is all as if the 3 contemporary powers, and by powers I mean those institutions that don't run up against counterpowers anywhere, had eradicated long-term memory, the 1,000-year-old traditions, the experience accumulated by cultures that have just died or that these powers are killing. Here we are faced with a problem caused by a civilization that has now been in place for more than a century and that was itself engendered by the long-term cultures that preceded it. It's damaging a physical system millions of years old, a system that fluctuates and yet remains relatively stable through rapid, random, and multi-century variations. Before us is an anguishing question, whose principal component is time, especially a long-term time that is all the longer when the system is considered globally. Mixing the waters of the oceans requires a cycle estimated at 5,000 years. We are proposing only short-term answers or solutions, because we live with immediate reckonings, upon which most of our power depends. Continuity belongs to administrators, the day-by-day to the media, and to science belong the only plans for the future we have left. The 3 powers have control over time, so now they can rule or decide on the weather. How can one not be surprised, by the way, by the situation in news reporting where the reduction of time to the all-important passing instant is paralleled by the obligatory reduction of news items to passing catastrophes, assumed to be the only things of interest? It's as if the very short term were linked to destruction. Must we understand, conversely, that building requires the long term? The same thing in science. What secret relations does refined specialization have with analysis, which destroys the object, already carved up by specialization? It so happens that we must decide about the greatest object of scientific knowledge and practice, the planet Earth, this new nature. To be sure, we can slow down the processes already underway, legislate reductions in fossil fuel consumption, massively replant the devastated forests, all fine initiatives, but together they amount to the image of a ship sailing at 25 knots toward a rocky bar on which it will inevitably be smashed to pieces, and on whose bridge the officer of the watch advises the engine room to reduce speed by 1/10 without changing direction. To become effective, the solution to a long-term, far-reaching problem must at least match the problem in scope. Those who used to live out in the weather's rain and wind, whose habitual acts brought forth long-lasting cultures out of local experiences, peasants and sailors, have had no say for a long time now, if they ever had it. It is we who still have a say, administrators, journalists, and scientists, all men of the short term and of highly focused specialization. We're partly responsible for the global change in the weather because we invented or distributed the means and the tools of powerful, effective, beneficent, and harmful intervention. We're inept at finding reasonable solutions because we're immersed in the brief time of our powers and imprisoned in our narrow domains. If there is a material, technological, and industrial pollution which exposes weather to conceivable risks, then there is also a second pollution, invisible, which puts time in danger. A cultural pollution that we have inflicted on long-term thoughts, those guardians of the earth, of humanity, and of things themselves. If we don't struggle against the second, we will lose the fight against the first. Who today can doubt the cultural nature of what Marxists used to call the base? How are we to succeed in a long-term enterprise with short-term means? We must pay the price of such a plan by a harrowing revision of today's culture, which rests on the three powers that dominate our short-term obsessions. Have we lost the memory of the antediluvian age, when a patriarch, from whom we're doubtless descended, had to construct an ark, a small-scale model of the totality of space and time, to prepare for an overflow of the sea caused by some thaw in the ice caps? In memory of those who have fallen silent forever, let us then give long-term men their say. A philosopher can still learn from Aristotle. A jurist does not find Roman law too old. Let's listen to them a moment, before painting the portrait of the new political leader. The Philosopher of Science asks, but who, then, is inflicting on the world, which is henceforth a common objective enemy, this harm that we hope is still reversible, this oil spilled at sea, this carbon monoxide spread in the air by the millions of tons, these acidic and toxic chemicals that come back down with the rain? Whence comes this filth that is choking our little children with asthma and covering our skin with blotches? Who beyond private and public persons? What, beyond enormous metropolises, considered either as aggregations of individuals or as networks of relations? Our tools, our arms, our efficacy, in the end our reason, about which we're so legitimately vain. Our mastery and our possessions. Mastery and possession, these are the master words launched by Descartes at the dawn of the scientific and technological age, when our Western reason went off to conquer the universe. We dominate and appropriate it. Such is the shared philosophy underlying industrial enterprise, as well as so-called disinterested science, which are indistinguishable in this respect. Cartesian mastery brings science's objective violence into line, making it a well-controlled strategy. Our fundamental relationship with objects comes down to war and property. War, once again. The sum total of harm inflicted on the world so far equals the ravages a world war would have left behind. Our peacetime economic relations, working slowly and continuously, produce the same results as would a short global conflict, as if war no longer belonged to soldiers alone, now that it is prepared and waged with devices as scientific as those used by civilians in research and in industry. Through a kind of threshold effect, the growth of our means makes all ends equal. We so-called developed nations are no longer fighting among ourselves. Together we are all turning against the world, literally a world war, and doubly so, since the whole world, meaning all men, imposes losses on the world, meaning things. We shall thus seek to conclude a peace treaty. Dominate, but also possess. The other fundamental relationship we have with the things of the world comes down to property rights. Descartes' master word amounts to the application of individual or collective property rights to scientific knowledge and technological intervention. The clean and the dirty. I have often remarked that, just as certain animals piss on their territory so that it stays theirs, many men mark and dirty the things they own by shitting on them in order to keep them, or shit on other things to make them their own. This stercoraceous or excremental origin of property rights seems to me a cultural source of what we call pollution, which, far from being an accidental result of involuntary acts, reveals deep intentions and a primary motivation. Let's have lunch together. When the salad bowl is passed, all one of us has to do is spit in it, and it's all his, since no one else will want any more of it. He will have polluted that domain, and we will consider dirty that which, being clean only to him, he now owns. No one else ventures again into the places devastated by whoever occupies them in this way. Thus the sullied world reveals the mark of humanity, the mark of its dominators, the foul stamp of their hold and their appropriation. A living species, ours, is succeeding in excluding all the others from its niche, which is now global. How could other species eat or live in that which we cover with filth? If the soiled world is in danger, it's the result of our exclusive appropriation of things. So forget the word environment, commonly used in this context. It assumes that we humans are at the center of a system of nature. This idea recalls a bygone era, when the earth, how can one imagine that it used to represent us, placed in the center of the world, reflected our narcissism, the humanism that makes of us the exact midpoint or excellent culmination of all things? No, the earth existed without our unimaginable ancestors, could well exist today without us, will exist tomorrow or later still without any of our possible descendants, whereas we cannot exist without it. Thus we must indeed place things in the center and us at the periphery, or better still, things all around and us within them like parasites. How did the change of perspective happen? By the power and for the glory of men. Reversal. Through our mastery, we have become so much and so little masters of the earth that it once again threatens to master us in turn. Through it, with it, and in it, we share one temporal destiny. Even more than we possess it, it will possess us, just as it did in the past, when old necessity, which submitted us to natural constraints, was still around. But it will possess us differently than back then locally, now globally. Why must we now seek to master our mastery? Because, unregulated, exceeding its purpose, counterproductive, pure mastery is turning back on itself. Thus former parasites have to become symbionts. The excesses they committed against their hosts put the parasites in mortal danger, for dead hosts can no longer feed or house them. When the epidemic ends, even the microbes disappear for lack of carriers for their proliferation. Not only is the new nature as such global, but it reacts globally to our local actions. We must then change direction and abandon the heading imposed by Descartes' philosophy. Because of these crossed interactions, mastery only lasts for the short term before turning into servitude. Property, similarly, has a rapid ascendancy or else ends with destruction. This is history's bifurcation, either death or symbiosis. Yet this philosophical conclusion, once known and practiced by agrarian and maritime cultures, though on a local scale and in narrow temporal limits, would remain a dead letter if it were not inscribed in law. The Jurist. 3 laws without a world. The social contract. Philosophers of modern natural law sometimes trace our origin to a social contract that we are said to have signed among ourselves, at least virtually, in order to enter into the collectivity that made us the men we are. Strangely silent about the world, this contract, they say, made us leave the state of nature to form society. From the time the pact was signed, it is as if the group that had signed it, casting off from the world, were no longer rooted in anything but its own history. This sounds like the local and historical description of the rural exodus toward the cities. It clearly means that from that point on we forgot the aforementioned nature, which is now distant, mute, inanimate, isolated, infinitely far from cities or groups, from our texts, and from publicity. By publicity I mean the essence of the public, which henceforth constitutes the essence of men. Natural law. The same philosophers call natural law a collection of rules said to exist outside of any formulation. Being universal, this law would follow from human nature. The source of man-made laws, natural law follows from reason inasmuch as reason governs all men. Nature is reduced to human nature, which is reduced to either history or reason. The world has disappeared. Modern natural law is distinguished from classical natural law by this nullification. Self-important men are left with their history and their reason. Curiously, reason acquires in the legal sphere a status quite similar to the one it had acquired in the sciences. The laws are all on its side because it founds the law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man. In France, we celebrated the bicentennial of the Revolution, and at the same time that of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Those rights, according to the text, issue explicitly from natural law. Like the social contract, the Declaration ignores the world and remains silent about it. We no longer know the world because we have conquered it. Who respects the victims? The aforementioned declaration was pronounced in the name of human nature and in favor of the downtrodden and the wretched, those who, excluded, lived outdoors, outside, submerged with all hands in the winds and rain, those for whom the time of life passing was bound to the weather. In the name of those who enjoyed no rights, losers of all imaginable wars, who owned nothing. Monopolized by science and by all the technologies associated with property rights, human reason conquered external nature in a combat that has lasted since prehistory, but that sped up relentlessly with the Industrial Revolution, more or less at the same time as the revolution whose bicentennial we celebrated, the one technological, the other political. Once again, we must rule in the case of the losers, by drafting the rights of beings who have none. We conceive laws based on a legal subject, whose definition has progressively broadened. In the past, not just anyone could attain this status. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen gave the possibility to every man to attain the status of subject of the law. The social contract was thereby completed, but closed upon itself, leaving the world on the sidelines, an enormous collection of things reduced to the status of passive objects to be appropriated. Human reason was of age, external nature a minor. The subject of knowledge and action enjoys all rights, and its objects none. They have not yet attained any legal dignity, which is why, since that time, science has all the laws on its side. Thus we necessarily doom the things of the world to destruction, mastered and possessed, from the epistemological point of view, minors in the pronouncement of the law. Yet they receive us as hosts, and without them we would die tomorrow. Exclusively social, our contract is becoming poisonous for the perpetuation of the species, its global and objective immortality. What is nature? First, all the conditions of human nature itself, its global constraints of rebirth or extinction, the hostelry that gives us lodging, heat, and food. But nature also takes them away from us as soon as we abuse them. It influences human nature, which in turn influences nature. Nature behaves as a subject. Use and abuse. The parasite. In its very life and by its practices, the parasite routinely confuses use and abuse. It accords itself rights, which it exercises by harming its host, sometimes without any advantage for itself. The parasite would destroy the host without realizing it. Neither use nor exchange has value in its eyes, for it appropriates things. One could say that it steals them, prior to use or exchange. It haunts and devours them. The parasite is always abusive. Conversely, law in general can surely be defined as the minimal and collective limitation of parasitic action. For parasitism, in fact, follows the simple arrow of a flow moving in one direction, but not the other, in the exclusive interest of the parasite, which takes everything and gives back nothing, along this one-way street. The judicial, on the other hand, invents a double, two-way arrow that seeks to bring flows into balance through exchange or contract. At least in principle, it denounces one-sided contracts, gifts without counter-gifts, and ultimately all abuses. The just scale of the law contravenes the parasite from its foundation. This scale sets the equilibrium of a balance sheet against any abusive disequilibrium. What is justice if not this double arrow, this very scale, or the unbroken effort to institute it within relations of force? We must, therefore, carry out a harrowing revision of modern natural law, which presupposes the unformulated presupposition that only man, individually or in groups, can become a legal subject. This is where parasitism reappears. The Declaration of the Rights of Man had the merit of saying, every man, and the weakness of thinking, only men, or men alone. We have not yet set up a scale in which the world is taken into account, in the final balance sheet. Objects themselves are legal subjects, and no longer mere material for appropriation, even collective appropriation. Law tries to limit abusive parasitism among men, but does not speak of this same action on things. If objects themselves become legal subjects, then all scales will tend toward an equilibrium. Equilibria. There are one or several natural equilibria, described by physical mechanics, thermodynamics, the physiology of organisms, ecology, or systems theory. Cultures have even invented one or more human and social equilibria, which are decided on, organized, and maintained by religion, laws, or politics. But something is missing. We are not conceiving, constructing, or putting into operation a new global equilibrium between the two sets of equilibria. Social systems, which are self-compensating and self-enclosed, press down with their new weight, that of their relations, object worlds, and activities, on self-compensated natural systems, just as in the past natural systems put social systems at risk, in the age when necessity triumphed over reason's means. Blind and mute, natural fatality neglected back then to sign an explicit contract with our ancestors, whom it crushed. Now we are sufficiently avenged for this archaic abuse by a reciprocal modern abuse. It remains to us to imagine a new delicate balance between these two sets of balances. As far as I know, this just weighing is at the origin of the verb to think, penser, as well as of the verb to compensate. Today, this is what we name thought. This is the most general legal order for the most global systems. The natural contract. Henceforth, men come back into the world, the worldly into the worldwide, the collectivity into the physical. It's a bit like the era of classical natural law, but with big differences, all of which have to do with the recent passage from the local to the global, and with our renewed relationship to the world, which was long ago our master, and of late our slave, always and in all cases our host, and now our symbiont. Back to nature, then. That means we must add to the exclusively social contract a natural contract of symbiosis and reciprocity, in which our relationship to things would set aside mastery and possession in favor of admiring attention, reciprocity, contemplation, and respect, where knowledge would no longer imply property nor action mastery, nor would property and mastery imply their excremental results and origins. An armistice contract in the objective war, a contract of symbiosis, for a symbiont recognizes the host's rights, whereas a parasite, which is what we are now, condemns to death the one he pillages and inhabits, not realizing that in the long run he's condemning himself to death too. The parasite takes all and gives nothing. The host gives all and takes nothing. Rights of mastery and property come down to parasitism. Conversely, rights of symbiosis are defined by reciprocity. However much nature gives man, man must give that much back to nature, now a legal subject. What do we give back, for example, to the objects of our science from which we take knowledge? Whereas the farmer in bygone days gave back, in the beauty that resulted from his stewardship, what he owed the earth, from which his labor wrested some fruits. What should we give back to the world? What should be written down on the list of restitutions? In the last century, we pursued the ideal of two revolutions, both egalitarian. The people takes back its political rights, restored after having been stolen. Likewise, the proletariat regains the enjoyment of the material and social fruits of its labor. These were quests for balance and equity within the exclusively social contract, which was formerly unjust or one-sided, and is always tending to become unbalanced again. So fiercely does our animality strive to restore hierarchy that such a quest can never end. While we're pursuing it, a second quest begins, one that will characterize our future history just as the previous one left its mark on the last century. This second quest involves the same search for balance and justice, but between new partners, the global collectivity and the world as such. We shall no longer gain knowledge in the scientific sense, nor will our industries labor and transform the peaceful face and entrails of the world, as we once did. Collective death is seeing to this global contractual change. It could be said that the reign of modern natural law began at the same time as the scientific, technological, and industrial revolutions, with the mastery and possession of the world. We imagined that we'd be able to live and think among ourselves, while things around us obediently slumbered, crushed by our hold on them. Human history could take pleasure in itself, in an acosmism of inanimate matter and of other living things. History can be made of everything, and everything comes down to history. Slaves never sleep for long. This period is coming to an end, now that awareness of things is violently calling us back. Irresponsibility only lasts through childhood. What language do the things of the world speak, that we might come to an understanding with them, contractually? But after all, the old social contract too was unspoken and unwritten. No one has ever read the original, or even a copy. To be sure, we don't know the world's language, or rather we know only the various animistic, religious, or mathematical versions of it. When physics was invented, philosophers went around saying that nature was hidden under the code of algebra's numbers and letters. That word code came from law. In fact, the earth speaks to us in terms of forces, bonds, and interactions, and that's enough to make a contract. Each of the partners in symbiosis thus owes, by rights, life to the other, on pain of death. All of that would remain a dead letter if we didn't invent a new type of political leader. The political. When he talks politics, Plato sometimes cites the example of the ship, of the crew's submission to the helmsman, an expert governor, but he never mentions what is exceptional about this model, doubtless because he's unaware of it. Between ordinary life on land and the heaven or hell at sea lies the possibility of withdrawal. On board, social existence never ceases, and no one can retire to his private tent, as the infantry warrior Achilles did so long ago. On a boat, there's no refuge on which to pitch a tent, for the collectivity is enclosed by the strict definition of the guardrails. Outside the barrier is death by drowning. This total social state, which delighted the philosopher for reasons we would judge base, holds seagoers to the law of politeness, where polite means politic or political. There is localness, being there, when there is leftover space. Since remotest antiquity, sailors, and doubtless they alone, have been familiar with the proximity and connection between subjective wars and objective violence, because they know that if they come to fight among themselves, they will condemn their craft to shipwreck before they can defeat their internal adversary. They get the social contract directly from nature. Unable to have any private life, they live in ceaseless danger of anger. A single unwritten law thus reigns on board, the divine courtesy that defines the sailor, a non-aggression pact among seagoers who are at the mercy of their fragility. The ocean threatens them continuously with its inanimate but fearsome strength, seeing to it that they keep the peace. The social pact of courtesy on the seas is altogether different from the contract by which other human groups organize themselves and even originate. The seagoing pact is in fact equivalent to what I'm calling a natural contract. Why? Because here the collectivity, if sundered, immediately exposes itself to the destruction of its fragile niche, with no possible recourse or retreat. Its habitat has no supplement, no refuge like Achilles' tent, that small private landlubber's fort to which the light infantryman can retreat when angry with fellow foot soldiers. Because it has no leftover space to which to withdraw, the ship provides a model of globality, being there, which is local, belongs on land. From the beginning of our culture, the Iliad is opposed to the Odyssey, as conduct on land, which takes only people into account, is to the ways of the sea, which deal with the world. Thus the soldiers of the first poem, an historical epic, become companions in the second, literally a geographical text and map, where the known earth itself writes, and where we can already see a natural contract, concluded silently and out of fear or respect, between the rumbling ire of the great social beast and the noise, sound, and fury of the sea. An agreement between deaf Ulysses and the clamouring sirens, a pact between the prow and the waves, the peace of men confronting the winds. But what language do the things of the world speak? The voice of the elements comes through the throats of those strange women who sing in the enchanted straits. We have made politics and economics into their own disciplines, so as to define power. How are we to think of fragility? By the absence of a supplement. In contrast, strength has reserves at its disposal. It defends itself everywhere, attacks along other lines, falls back on prepared positions, like Achilles in his tent, and has provisions to eat. A full and rigid totality, however, can break from rigor or hardness, like a prow lying to against surging waves. This explains why fuzzy sets, equipped with leftover spaces and refuges, can be so resistant. There's nothing weaker than a global system that becomes a single unit. A single law corresponds to sudden death. The more plural an individual becomes, the better he lives. The same is true for societies, or for being in general. Here, then, is the form of contemporary society, which can be called doubly worldwide, occupying all the earth, solid as a block through its tightly woven interrelations. It has nothing left in reserve, no external place of withdrawal or recourse on which to pitch its tent. Society knows, moreover, how to construct and use technologies whose spatial, temporal, and energetic dimensions are on the scale of worldwide phenomena. Our collective power is therefore reaching the limits of our global habitat. We're beginning to resemble the Earth. Thus, our de facto unified group borders the world, to which it is equipotent, just as the solid and mobile deck all but touches the surface of the waves, separated only by the stanchions of the guardrail. Everyone sails upon the world like the ark upon the waters, without any reserve outside these two sets, that of man and that of things. So here we are, underway. For the first time in history, Plato and Pascal, who never went to sea, are both right at the same time. For here we are, constrained to obey shipboard laws, to pass from the social contract to the natural contract. The social contract long protected mobile social subsets in a broad and free environment, equipped with reserves that could absorb any damage. But a unified, compact group that has reached the strict limits of objective forces requires a natural contract. There, our global range, arms, and technologies affect the totality of the world, whose wounds thus inflicted affect, in return, the totality of human beings. The objects of politics are, henceforth, these three connected totalities. Of governing. The helmsman governs. Following his intended route, and according to the direction and force of the sea swell, he angles the blade of the governnail, or rudder. His will acts on the vessel, which acts on the obstacle, which acts on his will, in a series of circular interactions. First and then last, first a cause and then a consequence, before once again becoming a cause, the project of following a route adapts in real time to conditions that unceasingly modify it, but through which it remains stubbornly invariant. The helmsman's project decides on a subtle and fine tilt of the rudder, a tilt selected within the directional movement of objective forces, so that in the end the route can be traced through the set of constraints. Cybernetics was the name given to the literally symbiotic art of steering or governing by loops engendered by these angles, and that engender in turn other directional angles. This technique was once specific to the helmsman's work, but it has recently passed into other technologies just as intelligent as this command of seaworthy vessels. It has moved from this level of sophistication to the grasping of even more general systems, which could neither subsist nor change globally without such cycles. But this whole arsenal of methods remained only a metaphor when it came to the art of governing men politically. What does the helmsman with his governale have to teach those who govern? Their difference is now vanishing. Today, what everyone does gives rise to harm inflicted on the world, and this damage, through an immediate or foreseeably deferred feedback loop, becomes the givens of everyone's work. I am deliberately playing on a single word of exchange: give. We receive gifts from the world, and we inflict upon it damage that it returns to us in the form of new givens. Cybernetics is back. For the first time in history, the human or worldly world is united in facing the worldwide world, without play, remainder, or recourse for the whole of the system, just as on a ship. The governor and the helmsman with his governale become identified in a single act of governing. The helmsman acts in real time, here and now, on a local circumstance from which he counts on obtaining a global result. It is the same for the governor, the technician, and the scientist. When scientists, gathering their local models into a totality mimicking the Earth, plan some intervention, they speak of steering committees and pilot projects. Immersed in the exclusively social contract, the politician has been countersigning it up until today, rewriting it, and having it observed. He is solely an expert in public relations and social sciences. Eloquent, even an orator, conceivably a man of culture, he knows minds and hearts, and group dynamics. There's quite a bit of administrator in him, and a media personality, a must. Essentially, he's a jurist, a product and producer of law. No point in trying to make himself a physicist. None of his speeches spoke of the world. Instead, they endlessly discussed men. Once again, publicity, as the rules for forming such a word demand, is defined as the essence of the public. Thus, more than anyone else, the politician indulges in no speech or gesture without saturating them in publicity. What's more, recent history and tradition taught him that natural law expresses only human nature. Closed up in the social collectivity, he could be splendidly ignorant of the things of the world. All that has just changed. The word politics must now be considered inaccurate because it refers only to the polis, the city-state, the spaces of publicity, the administrative organization of groups. Yet those who live in cities, once known as bourgeois, know nothing of the world. From now on, those who govern must go outside of the human sciences, outside the streets and walls of the city, become physicists, emerge from the social contract, invent a new natural contract by giving back to the word nature its original meaning of our natal and native conditions, the conditions in which we were born, or ought to be reborn, tomorrow. Conversely, the physicist, in both the most ancient Greek and the most modern sense, is getting closer to the politician. In a memorable passage describing the art of governing, Plato sketches the king weaving rational weft yarn onto a warp bearing less reasonable passions. Now we are at the dawn of an era in which the new prince will have to cross the woof of law with a warp born of the physical sciences. Political art will follow this weaving. In the past, I gave the name Northwest Passage to the place where these two types of knowledge converged, but I did not know, in so doing, that I was defining today's political science. Geopolitics in the sense of the real earth, physiopolitics in the sense that the institutions that groups create will henceforth depend on explicit contracts concluded with the natural world. The natural world will never again be our property, either private or common, but our symbiont. History anew. However mythical it may be, the social contract thus marks the beginning of societies. Because of some needs or other, given men decide, on a given day, to live together and thus to join forces. Since that time, we no longer know how to do without one another. When, how, why this contract was or was not signed, we do not know, and will doubtless never know. What does it matter? Since that legendary time, we have multiplied the number of legal contracts. We can't decide whether these contracts were established on the model of the first one, or whether we imagine the fiction of the originary contract on the model of the standard contract settled by our laws. Again, what does it matter? But these laws had and have the genius of delimiting objects, which are attributable by these laws to subjects the laws also define. We imagine that the social contract joined together, purely and simply, bear individuals, whereas laws, since they involve cases and causes and recognize the existence of things, integrate things into society. Laws thus steady society by using ponderous objects to weigh down fickle subjects and their unstable relationships. No human collectivity exists without things. Human relations go through things. Our relations to things go through men. This is the slightly more stable space described by laws. Sometimes I imagine that the first legal object was the cord, the bond, lien in French, which we read only abstractly in the terms obligation and alliance, but more concretely in attachment, a cord that materializes our relations or changes them into things. If our relations fluctuate, this solidification settles them. Based on the model of those contracts, a new collectivity joined together, this time on known historical dates, to stabilize objects better still. The contract of scientific truth synthesizes an exclusively intersubjective social contract of constant reciprocal surveillance and agreement in real time about what it is appropriate to say and do, with a truly juridical contract defining certain objects and specifying competencies, experimental procedures, and the analytical attribution of properties. Then things gradually leave the network of our relations to take on a certain independence. Truth demands that we speak of things as if we were not there. A science, from its inception, indissolubly associates the collectivity and the world, the accord and the object of accord. The contractual act makes these three types of association, social, legal, and scientific, resemble one another, even though the social contract is globally collective. The 1,000 varieties of law disperse association into 1,000 subgroups, and scientific contracts are at once local and global. But the relations of these associations to objects distinguish them. The world, which is totally absent from the social contract, as from the social sciences, is slowly permeating collective decisions, through causes that have become things, then through the causality of things themselves. Only bit by bit does the world make its way into these collectivities. How few philosophies conceive the collectivity as living in the global world. From now on, I mean by natural contract, above all, the precisely metaphysical recognition, by each collectivity, that it lives and works in the same global world as all the others. Not only every political collectivity joined by a social contract, but also every other kind of collectivity, military, commercial, religious, industrial, and so on, joined by a legal contract, and also the collectivity of experts joined by the scientific contract. I call the natural contract metaphysical because it goes beyond the ordinary limitations of the various local specialities, physics in particular. It is as global as the social contract, and in a way makes the social contract enter the world, and it is as worldwide as the scientific contract, and in a way makes the scientific contract enter history. Virtual and unsigned, like the first two contracts, since it seems that the great fundamental contracts remain tacit, the natural contract recognizes and acknowledges an equilibrium between our current power and the forces of the world. Just as the social contract recognizes some equality between its human signatories, just as the various legal contracts seek to balance the interests of the parties, and just as the scientific contract creates an obligation to repay in reason what is received in information, so the natural contract acknowledges above all the new equality between the force of our global interventions and the globality of the world. The thing that stabilizes our relations and that science measures remains local, carved up, limited. Law and physics define it. Today it is growing to the dimensions of the earth. Finally, the scientific truth contract succeeds brilliantly in showing us the object's point of view, as it were, just as the other contracts showed us, by the bond or ligature of their obligations, so to speak, the point of view of the other partners in the accord. The natural contract leads us to consider the world's point of view in its totality. Any contract creates a collection of bonds whose network canonizes relations. Today, nature is defined by a set of relations whose network unifies the whole earth. The natural contract connects the second and first networks into one. The religious. We are constantly losing our memory of the strange acts that priests used to practice alone in somber and secret nooks, where they would dress the statue of a god, adorn it, ready it, raise it up or take it out, prepare a meal for it, and talk to it constantly. They would do this every day and every night, at dawn and at dusk, when the sun and the shade reached their apogee. Were they afraid that a single pause in this continuous, infinite upkeep in conversation would open the door to tremendous consequences? Amnesiacs that we are, we believed that they adorned the god or goddess sculpted in stone or wood. No, they were giving to the thing itself, marble or bronze, the power of speech, by conferring on it the appearance of a human body endowed with a voice. So they must have been celebrating their pact with the world. Likewise, we are forgetting why the Benedictine monks get up before dawn to sing matins and lauds, the minor hours of prime, terce, and sect, or put off their rest until late into the night in order to chant again at compline. We don't remember these necessary prayers or these perpetual rites, and yet, not far from us, Trappists and Carmelites still say the divine office without respite. They are not following time, but sustaining it. Their shoulders and their voices, from biblical verses to orisons, bear each minute into the next throughout duration, which is fragile and would break without them. And who, conversely, convinces us that there are no gaps in the threads or fabrics of time? Day and night, Penelope never left her loom. In the same way, religion presses, spins, knots, assembles, gathers, binds, connects, lifts up, reads, or sings the elements of time. The term religion expresses exactly this trajectory, this review or prolonging whose opposite is called negligence, the negligence that incessantly loses the memory of these strange actions and words. The learned say that the word religion could have two sources or origins. According to the first, it would come from the Latin verb religare, to attach. Does religion bind us together? Does it assure the bond of this world to another? According to the second origin, which is more probable, though not certain, and related to the first one, it would mean to assemble, gather, lift up, traverse, or reread. But they never say what sublime word our language opposes to the religious in order to deny it. Negligence. Whoever has no religion should not be called an atheist or unbeliever, but negligent. The notion of negligence makes it possible to understand our time and our weather. In the temples of Egypt, Greece, or Palestine, our ancestors, I believe, used to sustain time as if they were anxious about possible gaps. Here we are today, worried about disasters in the aerial protective fabric that guarantees not time passing, but the weather. They used to connect, assemble, gather, lift up, never ceasing all day long, like monks. And what if it turned out that human history and tradition exist simply because men, devoted to the longest term conceivable, have never stopped sewing time back together? Modernity neglects speaking in absolute terms. It cannot and will not think or act toward the global, whether temporal or spatial. Through exclusively social contracts, we have abandoned the bond that connects us to the world, the one that binds the time passing and flowing to the weather outside, the bond that relates the social sciences to the sciences of the universe, history to geography, law to nature, politics to physics, the bond that allows our language to communicate with mute, passive, obscure things. Things that, because of our excesses, are recovering voice, presence, activity, light. We can no longer neglect this bond. While we uneasily await a second flood, can we practice a diligent religion of the world? Some organisms, it is said, disappeared from the face of the earth as a result of their enormous size. This still astonishes us, that the biggest thing should be the weakest, like the whole earth, man as megalopolis or being everywhere, even God. Having long enjoyed the death of these grand and fragile entities, philosophy today is taking refuge in small details which give it a sense of security. Whose diligent shoulders can henceforth sustain this immense and fissured sky, which we fear, for the second time in a long history, will fall on our heads? Love. Without love, there are no ties or alliances. Here, finally, are the two double laws. Love one another. This is our first law. For 2,000 years, this is the only one that has been able to help us avoid, at least for a few moments, hell on earth. This contractual obligation is divided into a local law asking us to love our neighbors, and a global law requiring us to love at least humanity, if we do not believe in a God. It is impossible to separate the two precepts under penalty of hatred. Loving only one's neighbors, or one's own kind, leads to the team, the sect, to gangsterism and racism. Loving men as a group, while exploiting one's neighbors and kin, is the typical hypocrisy of preachy moralists. This first law remains silent about mountains and lakes, for it speaks to men about men as if there were no world. Here then is the second law, which asks us to love the world. This contractual obligation is divided into the old local law that attaches us to the ground where our ancestors lie, and a new global law that no legislator, as far as I know, has yet written, which requires of us the universal love of the physical earth. It is impossible to separate the two precepts under penalty of hatred. Loving the whole earth while laying waste the neighboring landscape, this is the typical hypocrisy of moralists who restrict the law to men and to language, which men alone use and master. Loving only one's own land leads to inexpiable wars caused by the passions of belonging. We used to know how to love our neighbor sometimes, and often the land. We have learned with difficulty to love humanity, which was once so abstract, but which we are starting to encounter more frequently. Now we must learn and teach around us the love of the world, or of our earth, which we can henceforth contemplate as a whole. Love our two fathers, natural and human, the land and the neighbor. Love humanity, our human mother, and our natural mother, the earth. It is impossible to separate these two double laws under penalty of hatred. To defend the land, we have attacked, hated, and killed so many men that some of them came to believe that these killings were the motor of history. Conversely, to defend or attack other men, we have laid waste the landscape without thinking about it, and we were preparing to destroy the whole earth. So the two contractual obligations, social and natural, have the same solidarity between them as that which binds men to the world and the world to men. Thus these two laws make up only one, which is inseparable from justice, at once natural and human. Together these laws ask each of us to pass from the local to the global, a difficult and badly marked trail, but one that we must blaze. Never forget the place from which you depart, but leave it behind and join the universal. Love the bond that unites your plot of earth with the earth, the bond that makes kin and stranger resemble each other. Peace, then, between the friends of forms and the sons of the earth, between those who pronounce the law and those who are attached to the land. Peace between the separated brothers, between the idealists of language and the realists of things themselves, and let them love one another. There is nothing real but love, and no other law.